You've just heard from Aloysius, who's a friend of mine, and someone that I learned from actually in mediation. And he is one of those very rare few individuals who have not only embraced the beauty of mediation, but he's actually taken on the practice of starting a mediation firm in Singapore. There are really not many of him. In fact, there's less than three, I would say, such companies like that who have made mediation the core business. So Aloysius has a lot of experience, right, in that regard. On my side, for the last 10, 12 years or so, a lot of my experience has been on the institutional level and also at the educational and training level. And one of the things that inspires me to continue working and teaching and educating and sharing about mediation with other people is it really is a very much more human way to resolve problems. When I first started law school, um, and I learned about the law and how we were supposed to deal with evidence, engage in trial, prepare arguments, and look for these rules that the courts have issued or the statutes have outlined. I must admit, I don't know if any of you who have read law or are reading law feel that way. I've always felt it to be a bit of a construct, right? It's a bit of a theater. There's a lot of reverence given to words, written by someone we've never met, and yet, the outcome of issues that are sometimes literally life and death hinge on what these people have written who have had absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with your case, right? And because of the way a lot of these rules are set up, the way you present evidence, the way you present your arguments, it makes it very inaccessible, right? Some people say it reduces access to justice as well. So when I first found out that there was actually a middle ground, a way to bring people more dynamically and actively to the table and give them a say and a way to participate, I thought this was the best way forward. And to be honest, for the longest time, I actually struggled with trying to identify what would be the difference between negotiation and mediation. Because if you are not familiar with the process and someone tells you, oh, a mediator's not a judge, a mediator's not a evaluator, the parties actually negotiate, to the lay person, they would think about that and say, well, then why do we need a mediator, right? Why do we bother having this extra person who incurs more cost, incurs more time, takes up more of our speaking time? And the more I learned about mediation and talked about mediation and set up accreditation standards, one thing became very clear to me. Mediators do not sell themselves well enough. And now that I've spent some time working in other industries, including the tech industry, you might say it's a little bit like the project manager. If any of you have friends who work in technology, right? There is this title, this position in a company that very few people, look up to, right? Which is the project manager, because they feel that they add very little value. They don't directly contribute to the coding, they're not the client. What value do they bring? They simply ask people for deadlines and so on. But there's a lot of analogies that I can draw from that, which is, you never really realize the value of a good project manager until they're gone. And likewise, you never really appreciate the value of a good mediator until you're stuck in the room without one. And a lot of that boils down to the intangible skills, the invisible paths and timelines that the mediator actually manages, very much like a project manager. They are there to take stock of the atmosphere, the environment, the tension, the human element, which you can't measure. Even with AI, you can ask the AI what is the level of tension in the room, but unless you feed it the enough amount of data, if you can even quantify that data, it's going to be very difficult for the AI to tell you what the answer is. So a lot of the value that mediators bring into a room are intangible, but they are there and it can be felt because they manage a lot of the human emotions. And if there's one thing I want to share with you for today that mediators undersell, it is their mastery over timing. When people speak, when people intervene, or when people are not allowed to speak, or when people are allowed to call for a break. There's actually a lot of power given to someone who controls timing, much more than people realize. A lot of you who prepare for the negotiations, for the cases that you'll be working on, my guess is you spend a lot of time thinking about what's my bottom line, what's my leverage, how can I put my best image forward, how can I convince them that working with us, going with our way is the best way forward. But I suspect not many of you, and I'm happy to be wrong here, not many of you may have spent enough time thinking about when you want to introduce your packages, when you want to introduce the fact that you have this bottom line, if you want to introduce it at all, when you want to say, I think that's enough, let's move on to the next topic. So it's not just the what that you need to plan for when you go for competitions or even for actual negotiations, even more so. It's the timing. Very experienced negotiators and mediators will tell you, never bring your best proposals before lunch. Some of them might even tell you, don't even pretend that you have a good proposal until I tell you as a mediator, it's the right timing to share. So timing is very important. Having the best plan in the world, the best deal, makes no difference if you pitch it at the wrong time. So that begs the question, how do you then figure out what is the right time? So if there's one thing that I've learned from teaching mediation skills to students, it's very often we are so preoccupied with getting all of our information out there on the table, we fail to notice whether our counterparties are ready to listen. We are so eager to share all the good work we've prepared that we often forget to check with people. Are we ready to move on to the next phase? Are we ready to, or what do you think? We don't truly, sincerely invite people to share their opinions because very often we're afraid. We're too afraid of hearing things we don't know how to deal with. So if there's one tip I can leave with you, from my experience, both as a coach, as an educator, and having organized competitions like this myself, when you speak, every time you speak with an intention to listen and be ready to work with the information you're given, whatever the answer may be. Don't speak hoping to hear a specific answer. If you speak only to hear people say yes, then of course, if they say no, you'll be very disappointed. But if you speak with a true desire to let people say whatever they want, and it truly does not matter to you what they say because you will work with what you're given, that will stand you in a very, very strong position as a negotiator. You'll be much more confident about your package because it doesn't really matter what people say on the other side. You're ready to adapt what you have to what they can present to you. Now, having worked on the problems a little bit, I've given some advice to the team. And again, congratulations to the Secretariat for organizing this. It's never easy organizing a competition, especially a cross-cultural one. I think you'll have a lot of fun playing around with the problems. And
Marcus, I think your input was invaluable. I think all the participants are here and they should know that you had some invaluable materials that you gave us in drafting the problem. Thank you. Thank you for
th-
that.
th- thank you. No, I think my contribution really was very much as an advisor. The Secretariat deserves the lion's share of the work and the praise. They work very, very hard. So I hope all of you really take their materials seriously because that would be the best thanks that they get to see how all of you engage with their material. I know when I wrote my problems, that was my biggest satisfaction, watching the teams, really dig down into the information and try their best to work in a full role play. And speaking on that about the role play, another thing that I hear very often is role plays are a waste of time. It's not like the real world. In the real world, we don't have time limits. In the real world, we don't have these kind of complications. My client will always be contactable. And whenever I hear that, I need to take a step back and ask myself, are we in the same world? Because in the real world, there are time limits. And you can't mediate forever, you can't negotiate forever. Sometimes you can book your client months in advance, and on the last minute, they might tell you, sorry, I need to go for some other engagement. Please go ahead. So it's not entirely fair to say, I think, that the real world is any much different from the role plays, right? I think one thing that is different is the stakes are different. You don't feel the stakes as much because you would have to imagine, right? And put yourself into the shoes. But I think everyone here, being budding professionals, representatives, and consultants in your future career or even advisors, you're going to have to do this on a daily basis. So the earlier you can get into the habit of stepping into the shoes of people whom you may not necessarily have done that work before, I think will stand you in very, very good stead. And on that last note, I just want to touch on this, that when you role play, it is not only the instructions before you that help you step into the psyche of the problem. It is also bringing your understanding of the world and the rules that govern that world into your appreciation for things that are not written down. So when I used to coach teams for competitions, not only would I ask them to read the problem, we would also take some time to sit aside, and I would say, what is not being said here, and what does that mean for the negotiation? What else is not being said? How is that relevant for us? Could it be relevant for us? Because that's also part of the general information. There are things that we assume, certain stereotypes, certain expectations of commerce that should happen. But if they didn't happen, what does that mean? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for the other side? How can we use that to build a more persuasive story? So that's something that I used to teach, get my teams, not really to come up with more information to fill the gaps, but really just to immerse yourself more in the situation. Because once you are surrounded by unknowns, generally what will happen is that you will want to work with the other side at the table to chart a path through, because nobody has all the answers. And I hope that as you negotiate with your counterparts on the role plays, you will be able to bring a lot more of that collaborative spirit, and most importantly, creatively generating options, whilst at the same time tapping on learning about each cultural nuance. I won't just say between, China and Pakistan, but culture can exist even at the micro level. So you may be from different countries, but you both may see the world the same way from a geopolitical standpoint. But you may have cultural differences if you look at your learning methodology, if you look at your culture at the classroom level, if you look at your culture at the competition level. I think Aloysius touched on this a little bit about how it's important to participate in the voice, the global changing voice of Asia.
Ý cô nè.
Oh,
Với khởi
Sorry about that.
no problem.
Our session is complete with some technical difficulty.
Yeah. So just as much as culture can exist between countries, it also exists in a much smaller scale between groups, between backgrounds. And what I've found traveling around the world is that instead of focusing on where we are different, I often try to focus on what makes us similar. So when I talk to people who are also engaged in promoting mediation, as soon as we find a common point about how all mediators are always asking, where can I get more cases? Suddenly, it doesn't matter which country you're from. We all have something in common to discuss about. We are working in the industry of mediation credentials. So I'll leave you with that thought on culture. Although this was really much more of a speech, happy to take any questions if anyone has. Thank you. And I wish all of you the best.
Thank you so much.
We have a question.
Sure. थोड़ा सा आप ऊंचा बोलो, आवाज आ जाएगी.
Mr. Marcus, can you hear me? We have a
Yes.
question. We have a question. It's throughout the process of mediation, what you might consider that a mediator might encounter some restriction, both ethical or formal restriction throughout the process of mediation.
I think one of the biggest restrictions, especially young mediators will face, and I would say restriction in inverted commas, is that if they are very used to particular rules of engagement, meaning that you should only speak when spoken to, you have to phrase your points in a specific way, you should only touch on topics where there's evidence. And you can tell where I'm going with this. A lot of ex-judges, a lot of ex-arbitrators, if you're very used to those rules, then you will feel very restricted in a mediation because nobody is following them. And then you as a mediator cannot force people to follow. So young mediators often feel that there's very little that they can do. But my counterpoint to this is everything that you can do is given to you by virtue of the party's consent. Just the other day, I was watching a video about how there's a culture of consent now in the world. You look at people who go online and talk about consent is everything. And I laughed because we've been doing this in mediation, except that we weren't just looking at issues, we were looking at the power of consent, at how the mediator can actually do a lot more than sometimes even a judge or an arbitrator. If the parties say, Mr. Mediator, Miss Mediator, please feel free to interrupt us every time we are going off tangent, you can interrupt. Judges may not be able to do that. If a judge interrupts an advocate or a solicitor, a lawyer who is presenting his arguments, the lawyer may file a complaint to say the judge was not being fair. There's a bias. But in a mediation, it's so different because as long as the parties consent, you have the power to do a lot of things. So then the question really becomes, what power do you as a mediator need from the parties in order to do your job effectively? I'm not
Marcus,
quite understood the question, but I heard restrictions and that was kind of what I latched on. But please let me know if that doesn't capture it.
Marcus Tarab here. I was just wondering, when it comes to consent, should the mediator at any point where the mediator believes in the best interest of the parties try to manufacture some consent, as in, can the mediator propose certain proposals where he can then solicit consent from the parties and then work accordingly? Or should this consent come from the parties organically without mediators' intervention or manufacturing of that consent?
This is a time immemorial topic that people will debate about. I like to look at it this way. Do you have insurance as a mediator? Because the reason why professionals like accountants, lawyers, doctors, why they buy professional indemnity insurance is because nobody's right 100% of the time. You can't be. And even if you're wrong, it doesn't mean people will chase you to make you liable. But on the off chance that they do, that's what the insurance is there for. Likewise, as a mediator, you're definitely not going to be right 100% of the time. If the parties follow your suggestions, who are they going to look for when things go wrong? They're going to look for you, right? And even if they don't come after you explicitly, they may do something worse. At least if they ask you for money, at worst, you go bankrupt. At worst.
Yeah.
They come after your reputation. That's it. Once your reputation is gone, there's nothing to talk about. It's very difficult to repair reputation and parties who are unhappy. So I think on paper, let's say you are the most wise, intelligent, informed. If you can see everything, I don't know if any of you watch Marvel, the Watcher, someone who can see the multiverse and everything. Even if you were such a person, right, it will not stop people from blaming you when things go wrong. So I always come from a position of self-preservation, because if you are somehow implicated and unable to carry on with your work in the future, in a way you are depriving other parties from the benefit of your role as a mediator. So I try to look at things more from a bigger picture, right? Now, my practical solution to this, and this is something I learned from an American mediator, a retired judge. He said, if I ever have to advise, I will advise them on the process, not the content. So, for example, I strongly recommend that the two parties should stop giving their opening statement. Let us move to one of the issues first. I see that we can't set an agenda. I think that's okay. I'll keep that in mind. But let's talk about the one issue that both sides can't seem to move beyond. That's my opinion as a mediator. I'm being very firm on the agenda. I'm being very firm on the process, but I'm not telling you what to do. Right? About the actual issue. And if they push comes to shove and they say, he's demanding 70 million, I'm only willing to pay 50 million, do you think we should divide this in half? 60, call it quits. I would say, I think you guys should take a break and think about it. I think you need to figure out whether 60 million makes sense for you or not. I think. So then I come up with a lot of ways to get them to focus on the process.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if you propose something and they like it, like I said, that's great. If you propose something and they don't like it, suddenly the whole respect for you, for the entire process is challenged. And I have seen situations where my co-mediator, much more senior than me, right? A lot of them with white hair, most of them with no hair. And the parties, the moment they lose faith and trust in the mediators because they're not neutral, given that they've given a proposal that they feel favors one other side more, it doesn't matter what happens for the rest of the day. That trust is gone, it's gone. Don't talk about consent. The whole session is wasted.